The emergency alarm screamed through the council chambers on Centris Prime, cutting through the usual political debates like a knife. Ambassador Thekvar, a tall blue-skinned diplomat from the Altarian Republic, rushed to the central communication hub where dozens of species representatives were already gathering. The massive holographic display flickered to life, showing a grainy transmission from the Outer Rim territories. "This is Mining Station Beta 7. Came a desperate voice through the static. The speaker was clearly terrified. His words rushed and panicked. "We're under attack. The Razak have found us. They've already destroyed our defense platforms and are targeting civilian shelters. Please, anyone who can hear this, we need immediate help." The transmission cut to horrific footage that made several council members step back in disgust. Razak warships, massive and angular like flying fortresses, hung in space above the peaceful mining colony. Bright orange explosions bloomed across the station's residential sections as the raiders systematically destroyed everything that couldn't fight back. Bodies floated in the vacuum, and the screams of the dying echoed through the emergency channels. Commander Thekvar felt his stomach turn. The Velthri were one of the most peaceful species in the galaxy. They spent their lives quietly extracting rare minerals from asteroid fields, never bothering anyone, never making enemies. They had no military, no weapons beyond basic mining equipment. They were exactly the kind of innocent victims the Razak loved to target. "How many ships?" asked General Caraxes, the military representative from the warrior planet Draken. The tactical officer, her tentacles dancing over the control panel, brought up the sensor data. 300 confirmed Razak vessels, sir. Standard raider configuration. They're not just looting this time. They're broadcasting the executions on all frequencies. It's psychological warfare. A collective shudder ran through the assembled diplomats. Everyone knew about Razak tactics. They didn't just kill their victims quickly. They made sure the entire galaxy could watch, spreading fear to make future targets surrender without a fight. It was brutally effective and completely horrifying. "Distance to Beta 7? Thekvar asked, already knowing the answer would be bad news. 47 light years from the nearest council fleet, came the reply. At maximum speed, our forces could arrive in 18 days. "Sir, the mining station won't last 18 hours. The chamber fell silent. 18 days might as well be 18 years. By the time any council forces arrived, there would be nothing left but empty space and floating debris. The Razak would have stripped everything valuable and moved on to terrorize the next defenseless world. General Caraxes stepped forward, his scaled face grim. "My people volunteer to respond, but we're currently engaged in the Sigma conflict. We can't abandon that front without losing 2 entire systems." Similar responses came from around the chamber. The Centaurian Navy was protecting trade routes from pirates. The Arcturian Defense Force was dealing with a plague outbreak that required quarantine enforcement. The Beetlejuice Alliance was already stretched thin across 3 different peacekeeping missions. Thekvar felt a familiar weight of helplessness that came with being a diplomat in an imperfect galaxy. There were simply too many crises and not enough resources to handle them all. Somewhere out there, innocent people were dying, and the greatest military alliance in galactic history couldn't do anything about it. "What about mercenaries?" suggested someone from the back of the chamber. "None available with sufficient force projection," the tactical officer replied. "And frankly, sir, most mercenary companies won't engage the Razak. Too dangerous. Not enough profit margin." That was when Thekvar remembered the newest addition to their membership files. "Wait," he said, accessing his personal datapad. "What about the humans? They just joined last month." Several council members exchanged glances. The humans were still largely unknown quantities. They'd made contact only 6 months ago, arriving in primitive but functional starships from a system most species had never heard of. Their diplomatic team had been polite but oddly confident, as if they weren't particularly impressed by galactic civilization. "So 3, right?" asked the tactical officer, pulling up the file. "Standard oxygen-breathing mammals. Recent spaceflight development. They've got maybe a dozen ships in the area, according to our patrol reports. 12 ships against 300? General Caraxes shook his head. "That's not rescue, that's suicide. But Thekvar was desperate, and desperate diplomats sometimes made decisions that would change the course of history. He activated the emergency communication protocols and began composing a message to Earth Command. In his request for assistance, he described the humans as a standard spacefaring civilization and estimated they could provide valuable support to the rescue mission. What Thekvar didn't know was that his own xenobiology department had classified Sol 3 as completely uninhabitable. The planet was listed in their databases as a class 12 Death World, where evolution had produced the most dangerous predators the galaxy had ever seen. The message streaked toward Earth at faster-than-light speed, carrying with it the hopes of dying civilians and the beginning of humanity's true introduction to galactic warfare. The message from the Galactic Council reached Earth's Outer Rim Defense Command at exactly 0347 hours, ship time. Admiral Jack Morrison was reviewing patrol reports in his quarters aboard the HMS Vengeance when his communication officer knocked on the door with unusual urgency. "Sir, we've got an emergency transmission from the Council. It's marked Priority Alpha," Lieutenant Kate Walsh said, her face serious. She'd been Morrison's tactical officer for 3 years and rarely looked this concerned. Morrison pulled on his uniform jacket and followed her to the bridge. The Vengeance was humanity's newest heavy cruiser, bristling with railguns and missile pods that could punch holes through small moons. Around them, 11 other human warships maintained formation, their crews running routine drills and equipment checks. The holographic display came to life, showing the desperate message from Ambassador Thekvar. Morrison watched in silence as the footage played, showing Razak raiders systematically destroying civilian targets while broadcasting the executions across the galaxy. His jaw tightened as he saw families being separated, children crying for parents who would never come home. "How many enemy ships?" Morrison asked quietly. 300 confirmed, sir," Walsh replied, pulling up the tactical data. Intelligence suggests standard Razak configuration. Heavy assault vessels, designed for terror tactics and rapid resource extraction. The bridge fell silent. Everyone was doing the math. 12 human ships against 300 alien raiders. By any conventional military analysis, it was hopeless. The smart play would be to report back to Earth Command that the situation was beyond their capabilities. But then Morrison looked at the faces of his crew. These were men and women who had grown up hearing stories about humanity's bloodiest conflicts. They knew about Stalingrad, where soldiers fought street by street for months. They remembered Iwo Jima, where Marines died taking fortified positions one bunker at a time. They'd studied the siege of Bastogne, where outnumbered troops held a frozen city against impossible odds. "Sir," said Commander Ben Harris, the ship's executive officer, "the crew's already volunteering. Engineering wants to know if we're loading the tungsten penetrators." Morrison almost smiled. That was humanity in a nutshell. When faced with impossible odds and innocent lives at stake, they didn't ask if they could win. They asked how much ammunition to bring. "Tell me about Razak tactics," Morrison said, calling up the enemy profile on the main screen. Walsh began reading from their intelligence files. They rely on overwhelming numerical superiority and psychological warfare. Standard approach is orbital bombardment of military targets, then systematic execution of civilians to break resistance. They broadcast the killings to terrorize future targets into surrendering without a fight. Weaknesses: their ships are heavily armored but relatively slow. They're used to fighting opponents who use energy weapons exclusively. Most galactic military doctrines emphasize shield penetration and electronic warfare. Morrison nodded slowly. The Razak had never fought humans before. They'd never encountered opponents who still use kinetic weapons designed to punch through physical armor rather than exotic energy shields. They'd never faced a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other with projectiles moving at hypersonic speeds. "Communication range to Beta 7? He asked. "For hours at maximum transmission speed, sir." "Send a message to the mining station. Tell them help is coming. Tell them to hold on." Morrison turned to face his bridge crew. "All ships, general quarters. I want every railgun loaded with armor-piercing rounds. Prep the missile batteries with nuclear-tipped warheads." The bridge erupted into controlled activity as orders flowed to the other ships in the fleet. Throughout the squadron, human sailors and marines began preparing for combat with the methodical efficiency their species had perfected over centuries of warfare. "Sir," Walsh said quietly, "the Council message suggests they think we're a standard spacefaring civilization. They don't seem to know much about human military capabilities." Morrison looked at the tactical display again, studying the Razak fleet composition. 300 ships arranged in the kind of loose formation that worked well against opponents who fought by galactic rules. Ships that maintained safe distances, used energy weapons, and avoided close-range combat at all costs. "They're about to learn," he said grimly. "Set course for Beta 7. Maximum acceleration. And patch me through to Earth Command. Tell them we're engaging a numerically superior force and may need reinforcements." As the human fleet changed course and began accelerating toward the crisis zone, Morrison couldn't help but think about the irony. For months, human diplomats had been trying to convince the galaxy that humanity deserved a seat at the civilized table. They'd emphasized human culture, human art, human philosophy. But sometimes civilization needed uncivilized solutions. Sometimes, when diplomacy failed and innocent people were dying, the galaxy needed to call the species that had learned warfare on a planet where everything tried to kill them. The Razak were about to discover why humans had survived on a class, 12 Deathworld. They were about to learn what happened when predators went hunting. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Beta 7 system like ghosts materializing from the void. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the HMS Vengeance, watching the tactical display paint a picture of systematic destruction. 300 Razak ships hung in space around the mining station like vultures, their dark hulls gleaming under the system's pale sun. "Jesus Christ," whispered Lieutenant Walsh, staring at the long-range sensors. "They're not even trying to hide it." The mining station was dying slowly. Sections of the massive structure were venting atmosphere into space, creating glittering clouds of frozen air and debris. But the worst part was the broadcasts. The Razak were transmitting their executions on every frequency, making sure the entire galaxy could watch as they methodically murder civilians. "Sir, we're picking up survivor signals from the residential sections," reported Communications Officer Ryan Bell. "Estimated 3,000 Veltharies still alive, but the Razak are moving through the station level by level." Morrison watched a group of Razak boarding craft dock with the station's civilian quarters. Through the grainy security feeds, he could see the alien raiders herding families into cargo bays. The Velthari were tall, graceful beings with pale blue skin and large, gentle eyes. They looked like the kind of species that had never hurt anyone in their lives. "Range to target?" Morrison asked, his voice deadly calm. 40,000 kilometers and closing, sir. We're still outside their sensor range." The Admiral studied the Razak formation. They were arranged in loose clusters around the mining station, their attention focused entirely on the systematic looting and killing taking place below. It was a kind of tactical positioning that worked perfectly against opponents who announced their presence and demanded formal surrender before engaging. "All ships silent running," Morrison ordered. "No active sensors, no communications. We go in dark." The human fleet continued its approach, using passive sensors and computer prediction to track the enemy positions. On ships throughout the squadron, Marines checked their weapons and prepared for boarding operations. In the engineering sections, crews loaded the railguns with tungsten penetrator rounds designed to punch through asteroid rock and spaceship armor with equal ease. "Sir, picking up a transmission from the Razak flagship," Walsh reported. "They're demanding that any Council forces identify themselves or be considered hostile." Morrison almost laughed. The Razak were so confident in their overwhelming numbers that they were actually challenging potential rescuers to show themselves. It was the kind of arrogance that came from never having faced real opposition. "Put me through to their flagship," Morrison said. "Why broadcast all frequencies?" The communication channel crackled to life. "This is Admiral Jack Morrison of the Human Colonial Navy. You are ordered to cease all hostile actions against the Velthari civilians and withdraw from the system immediately." The response came back within seconds. filled with what could only be described as mocking laughter. Pathetic mammals, came a harsh, guttural voice. I am War Leader Graxon of the Razak Horde. We are the apex predators of this galaxy. We take what we want, kill whom we choose, and no soft-skinned weaklings will stop us. Surrender now, and we might let some of you live as slaves. Morrison looked around his bridge. His crew was staring at the communication panel with expressions of cold fury. Lieutenant Walsh's hand was already moving toward the weapons control board. Commander Harris was pulling up targeting solutions on his tactical display. War Leader Graxon, Morrison said, his voice still perfectly calm. You're about to learn the difference between apex predators and Deathworld survivors. He nodded to Walsh. Fire. The HMS Vengeance launched a single railgun round at the Razak flagship. The tungsten projectile, accelerated to 15% of light speed, crossed the 40,000 kilometers in less than 2 seconds. The Razak ship's energy shields, designed to deflect plasma bolts and laser beams, didn't even register the physical projectile until it was already through them. The round hit the flagship's main hull like the fist of an angry god. It punched through armor plating that could withstand nuclear explosions, tore through internal bulkheads like tissue paper, and exited to the ship's far side, leaving a perfectly cylindrical hole 3 meters wide. The massive vessel, over 1 kilometer long and home to 10,000 Razak warriors, simply broke apart in an expanding cloud of atmosphere and debris. The Razak fleet went silent. For nearly a minute, no one transmitted anything. Then, suddenly, every alien ship in the system began screaming warnings and demands for information. All ships, Morrison announced his fleet, weapons free. Show them what humans learned on Earth. What followed wasn't a battle, in any traditional sense. It was a demonstration of what happened when a species that had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and global wars encountered opponents who had never faced anything more dangerous than energy weapons and diplomatic protests. Human railguns fired tungsten rounds that treated Razak armor like cardboard. Human missiles, guided by artificial intelligence that could calculate trajectories around moving obstacles, struck with nuclear precision. And when the Razak tried to close for boarding actions, they discovered that humans had been perfecting hand-to-hand combat. Since they learned to make stone tools, the terror in the alien transmissions was unmistakable. The first wave of Razak ships died so quickly that their allies barely had time to understand what was happening. Admiral Morrison watched the tactical display as enemy vessels simply disappeared from the screen, torn apart by weapons that ignored their shields and armor like they were made of paper instead of military-grade alloys. Sir, we're picking up panic transmissions across the Razak fleet, reported Communications Officer Bell, adjusting his headset. They're calling us void demons and deathspawn hunters. Their formation is starting to break apart. Morrison nodded grimly. The Razak had made their first critical mistake by assuming humans would fight like every other species they'd encountered. They expected formal challenges, energy weapon exchanges at safe distances, and plenty of time to coordinate responses. Instead, they got tungsten rounds moving at relativistic speeds and nuclear warheads that didn't care about fancy deflector shields. Captain Bradley, status report, Morrison said, opening a channel to the Destroyer Reaper. Captain Tom Bradley's voice crackled through the communication system, calm despite the chaos around him. 11 enemy vessels down, sir. We're tracking a cluster of boarding craft heading for the civilian sections. Request permission to intercept. Granted. Take them alive if possible. We need intelligence on their command structure. What happened next will become legendary among human military circles for decades to come. The Razak boarding parties, expecting to continue their systematic execution of civilians, instead found themselves facing Lieutenant Colonel Mike Stevens and his Marine assault teams. Stevens had grown up in the Australian outback, where everything from the spiders to the plants try to kill you. He'd spent his military career learning how to hunt insurgents in Afghan mountains and jungle guerrillas in South American rainforests. To him, fighting in the corridors of a space station was just another Tuesday. The Razak warriors were impressive by galactic standards. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, with natural armor plating and claws that could tear through steel. They'd terrorized dozens of species across the outer rim, building a reputation as unstoppable killers. but they'd never fought humans before. Stevens' Marines moved through the station's corridors like ghosts. They used the artificial gravity to their advantage, fighting on walls and ceilings when necessary. Their weapons fired bullets that could punch through Razak armor, while their tactical coordination was based on pack hunting strategies developed over millions of years of evolution. Contact! Section 7. Stevens reported over the radio, his voice eerily calm. 12 tangos, heavily armed. They're using Velthri civilians as shields. That was the Razak's second critical mistake. They assumed humans would be paralyzed by the threat to innocent lives, just like every other species they'd encountered. Instead, Stevens' team demonstrated why human military doctrine had been developed through centuries of asymmetric warfare. The Marines used smoke grenades to blind the Razak sensors, then move in with surgical precision. They'd spent years training for exactly this kind of scenario, where enemy combatants hid among civilians. Within 3 minutes, all 12 Razak warriors were down, and not a single Velthri had been harmed. This is impossible. Came a panic transmission from one of the surviving Razak ships. They fight like they can see in the dark. They move like pack hunters. What kind of species are these mammals? Morrison listened to the enemy communications with growing satisfaction. The psychological impact was exactly what he'd hoped for. The Razak were discovering that their reputation as apex predators meant nothing when facing a species that had earned its place at the top of Earth's food chain through millions of years of brutal selection pressure. "Sir, the Razak fleet is attempting to withdraw," Lieutenant Walsh reported. "They're abandoning their ground forces and trying to reach minimum jump distance." "Negative," Morrison said firmly. "All ships, pursue and engage. No Razak vessel leaves the system." They wanted to broadcast executions. Let's show the galaxy what happens when Deathworlders go hunting. The human fleet split into hunting packs, each group targeting fleeing Razak ships with predatory efficiency. The aliens had never encountered opponents who could coordinate attacks across multiple light minutes of space, using artificial intelligence and quantum communications to share targeting data in real time. Captain Lisa Parker, commanding the cruiser Retaliation, cornered 3 Razak vessels near the system's asteroid belt. "This is where it gets interesting," she told her crew with a predator smile. "They're trying to hide among the rocks." What followed was a masterclass in three-dimensional combat. The human ships use the asteroids as cover and concealment, appearing and disappearing like sharks in murky water. The Razak found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it. "They're not soldiers," transmitted one desperate Razak commander before his ship was vaporized by a railgun strike. "They're evolved killers. We're not fighting a military force. We're being hunted by demons from a nightmare world." Throughout the human fleet, similar scenes played out as Earth's finest demonstrated why their homeworld was classified as uninhabitable by most galactic species. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in their brutal history, the Razak were learning what it felt like to be prey. The last Razak ship died in a brilliant flash of nuclear fire, its hull torn apart by human railgun rounds that had punched through 3 meters of military-grade armor like it was tissue paper. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the HMS Vengeance, watching the tactical display, clear of enemy contacts for the first time in 6 hours. "All enemy vessels destroyed or disabled, sir," Lieutenant Walsh reported, her voice carrying a note of amazement. "Final count, 312 Razak ships eliminated. Human casualties, 7 wounded, 0 killed." Morrison nodded, but his attention was already focused on the rescue operations. Throughout the mining station, human Marines were evacuating survivors and providing medical aid to the wounded Velthri civilians. The gentle blue-skinned miners could barely comprehend what they'd witnessed. In less than a day, their nightmare had ended with the complete destruction of the most feared raider fleet in the galaxy. But the real impact was just beginning. Unknown to Morrison, automated recording systems throughout the battle zone had captured everything. Galactic news networks, military intelligence agencies, and diplomatic channels were already buzzing with footage that would change humanity's reputation forever. On Centris Prime, Ambassador Thekvar stared at his holographic display in stunned silence. The tactical readout showed the impossible. 12 human ships had not just defeated 300 Razak vessels, they'd annihilated them completely. The battle hadn't lasted 6 hours. It had been a systematic extermination, carried out with surgical precision. "Run the footage again," Thekvar ordered, his voice barely a whisper. The recording played once more, showing human railgun rounds moving at 15% light speed, punching through Razak shields and armor like they were made of air. Energy weapons that had terrorized the galaxy for decades simply bounced off human ships, while tungsten penetrators turned massive warships into expanding clouds of debris. But it was the boarding action footage that truly shocked the galactic audience. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens and his Marines moved through the mining station like predators born to hunt in confined spaces. They anticipated Razak movements, coordinated attacks with pack-hunting precision, and showed no fear of opponents that stood 3 meters tall and had natural armor plating. "By the void," whispered General Caraxes, the warrior representative from Draken. "They're not fighting like soldiers. They're hunting." Within hours, the footage had reached every major government in the galaxy. On a dozen different worlds, military analysts were frantically reviewing their files on humanity, trying to understand how they'd so completely misunderstood Earth's newest member species. Dr. Vextheri, the Council's chief xenobiologist, was pulled from her research laboratory to provide an emergency briefing. She stood before the assembled representatives with a grim expression, holding a data pad that contained information no one had bothered to read when humanity first made contact. Sol 3, also known as Earth, is classified as a class 12 Death World, she began, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. The planetary surface experiences regular mass extinction events, extreme weather patterns, an ecosystem based entirely on predator-prey relationships. We classified it as uninhabitable because nothing we know could survive there. She activated a holographic display showing Earth's history, ice ages, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, and plagues that would have wiped out most galactic species flashed across the screen. Humans didn't just survive on this world, Dr. Vextheri continued. They thrived. They became the apex predator of a planet where everything was trying to kill them. Their entire evolutionary development was shaped by millions of years of warfare, environmental catastrophe, and resource competition. The chamber erupted in nervous chatter. Species that had dismissed humanity as primitive mammals were suddenly realizing they'd been sitting next to the galaxy's most efficient killers for months, completely unaware of what they were dealing with. "What are the implications?" asked Ambassador Thekvar, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Militarily, humans represent a paradigm shift in galactic warfare. They use kinetic weapons that ignore our shield technology. They fight with pack coordination that makes them exponentially more dangerous in groups. Most importantly, they show no fear of death because they evolve in a world where survival required constant combat readiness." The recording from Beta 7 played again on every major news network in the galaxy. Criminal organizations watched human Marines hunting Razak warriors through the mining station and quietly updated their target lists with a simple addition: "Species human, do not engage under any circumstances." On the mining station itself, the rescued Veltri approached Admiral Morrison with something approaching religious reverence. Their elder, a tall female named Elijera, spoke for her people. "Admiral Morrison," she said, her voice filled with gratitude and wonder, "we owe you a debt that can never be repaid. But I must ask, are all humans like you?" Morrison looked around at his crew, then back at the grateful civilian. "Ma'am, we're just regular Navy personnel, doing our job. Back on Earth, we've got Marines, Special Forces, and people who make us look like kindergarten teachers." The implications of that statement rippled through the galaxy faster than any official diplomatic message. If these were just regular human soldiers, what were their elite forces capable of? Within a week, 17 different worlds had submitted formal requests for human protection. Earth Command found itself flooded with offers of alliance, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts from species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence just days before. The galaxy had spent centuries avoiding death worlds, never realizing that sometimes, when civilized solutions failed and innocent people were dying, they needed to call the species that had learned to survive in hell itself. Humanity had found their place in galactic civilization, not as diplomats or traders, but as the guardians others called when the monsters came calling.